Good morning, class. This is Mr. Harris, your psychology teacher, and this morning I'm going to make a video for you guys talking about psychoactive drugs. Now, our last unit we were working on was the consciousness unit, the states of consciousness. And the last state of consciousness we were looking at was those achieved by people adding chemicals to their body. Before break, everyone did their research project about different drugs and looked at some of these terms we're going to learn about today, but I thought I'd give a brief overview over the most significant drugs in our society today, as well as a little bit more vocabulary. Reminder, this is supposed to be a review for you guys. If you still have your notes packets, there's a couple more things that will go in here from this presentation. This presentation is also available on Google Classroom. Okay, let's get going with the information about psychoactive drugs in relation to psychology. So we started off before break talking about how humans are not alone in the animal kingdom as far as those that choose to use substances to alter their states of consciousness. Here we see our friend the koala, who is known for eating these eucalyptus leaves that, besides providing nutrition for the koala, also release a toxin that we believe gets the koala intoxicated. And there is lots of videos online of koalas falling out of trees as they've been too intoxicated. We also talked briefly about down in South America. We have jaguars that will eat this special vine that grows down there, and humans will use this vine and mix it with other substances to create a powerful hallucinogen called ayahuasca. We think that the jaguars down there are using the plants for a similar purpose. We also talked about our more closely related species, starting further back in the evolutionary chain, the lemur. Lemurs who find these millipedes that release toxins. They then chew them to get them to release these toxins and then rub it all over their fur, on their faces, partly as an insecticide, but also partly to change their states of consciousness. And in class, we also watched a video about monkeys. If we remember, monkeys seem to show the same levels of alcoholism as people do. That means the same percentage of monkeys who have access to alcohol will likely become addicted to it, as is true among people. All right, and going back to ancient times, we know that drugs have been abused for a long, long time. In Egypt, they had this infamous blue lotus flower that they allegedly used to intoxicate themselves with, as well as opiates that existed at the time. We have evidence of usage of cannabis or marijuana dating back at least several thousand years, some even older, going into prehistory. We found people with cannabis on their bodies. Now, in America today, unfortunately, we do have a huge problem with drug overdoses. And you can see from the chart below, it is more of a male problem than a female problem, but the numbers of females who are overdosing from drugs is rising as well. And in your guys' lifetimes, which not saying how old you are, but we've seen the number of drug overdoses double, triple, or quadruple. Now, this is mostly due to a increase in opiate use, which is one of the most dangerous drugs you can use, as well as this new drug called fentanyl that is causing more and more overdose deaths in our country. Okay. If we look at the significant drug uses around the world, the biggest ones are legal in the United States, tobacco and alcohol. However, those two, because partially they're legal and also because they're kind of culturally accepted, seem to be the biggest killers of people around the world as well. Tobacco and the smoking of it seems to cause cancer, lung cancer, throat cancer, mouth cancer, and that takes out a giant percentage of people who use it. Alcohol also contributes to cirrhosis of the liver and a number of other factors, raising up that death rate. And a lot of people overdose from it as well. After that, we have illicit drugs, and then you see they're not nearly as big a factor in killing people as the other ones. Now, this is comparing a couple of countries around the world as far as who is doing drugs, and we see that in America, somewhere between 25 and 30% of men claim they use drugs, while it's lower for women. This is still a very high number if you look at a number of other major countries around the world. Okay, and we talked about in class how the U.S. is at the top or near the top of every country as far as percentage of people who are using illicit drugs. Obviously, there are some that are more popular in other places, but I really want to point out for the United States, prescription opioids and then opioids down here in the corner. These are the two that cause the most drug overdoses, and we are leading the way in both of those categories. Okay. And when we look at what people are getting treatment for, we saw that for most people it is opiate treatment. But in some countries now, increasingly more and more, it's actually for cannabis. Even though cannabis is not considered as dangerous as a drug like heroin, people are developing a lot of issues with becoming emotionally, socially addicted to it, even if they're not necessarily physically addicted to this drug. And in the United States, unfortunately, we do have a lot of young people that are using drugs, although these numbers have gone down a lot in the past couple of decades as less high schoolers are using drugs today. But as you can see, marijuana or hashish is still the top among illicit drugs being used by middle schoolers as well as high schoolers. Okay, a couple of new vocabulary words we're going to add to it. This should have been something that would have been in your guys' presentations. So the first word is tolerance, and this is the body's diminished response to a drug, and it occurs when the body has adapted to the drug's presence. So the first time you use a drug, you'll feel a certain way, probably something very powerful effects from a drug. But afterwards, as your body's already experienced that before, it's harder and harder to reach that same level, and you have to use more drugs to get the same feeling. Now, I will speak from a little bit of personal experience when it comes to the drug of tobacco. As I mentioned to you guys in class, I found myself a smoker for a short period of time. The first time I had the cigarette, it was extremely powerful, gave me a crazy head rush, and then eventually I found myself smoking, but very little was actually happening to me as my body had built up a tolerance to it. Just so you guys know, I only smoked for about a month and then quit because I felt its effects upon my body. It was making me feel really bad. Now, when you attempt to quit drugs, your body may go through withdrawal. So these are the symptoms that occur when a drug is stopped or its intake is lessened. With drugs that are not very physically addictive, there may not be a lot of physical signs. If someone is quitting cannabis, for example, they're not going to get a fever or go through convulsions or anything like that. However, withdrawal also can talk about the psychological symptoms when getting off a drug. And even for a drug like cannabis was not considered to be addictive, although I think it is, that people getting off it could have a lot of mood swings and stuff like that. Now, for some drugs, the withdrawal is very dangerous. Heroin's the most infamous for how difficult it is to get off, although some experts say that it's more like a bad flu for a couple of days. Some people say the pain is intolerable when trying to quit off heroin. Alcohol withdrawal is also potentially risky as well. For hardcore alcoholics, if they stop taking the drug altogether, they can actually have seizures and die from that. Every hospital in America actually has medicinal beer just in case someone is coming in and suffering from alcohol withdrawal. Now, dependence is this idea that you need the drug to feel normal, okay? And like we mentioned with the other vocabulary words we were just looking at, the first time you try a drug, it may be extremely powerful, have a very large effect on you. However, afterwards, you either need to do more to get that same effect, or you may never be able to get to that same feeling again. Oftentimes, powerful stimulants can blow out some of your dopamine receptors, and you have a difficult time ever feeling as happy or as pleasant as you did in that first time. And again, dependence can be physical and psychological. A lot of people who are addicted to drugs are using them to treat underlying psychological conditions. So, depression, anxiety, these kind of issues, some people choose to self medicate with different drugs. And these drugs, they say, help them cope with going through their day to day life, but they feel like they need these drugs in order to have a decent life or at least appear normal in public. And when people have these drugs removed from them, oftentimes they do not have a very good time at all. Now, why is there addiction? Well, we know it's kind of a human behavior, as well as in some animal behaviors, in order to change your mind, in order to change your states of consciousness. Well, when we look at some other factors as well that can contribute to addiction, there seems to be very strong genetic predispositions. Now, this means that if you have parents or family members who have issues with drugs, you are more likely to have an issue with drugs as well. Remember, though, that this does not mean it's your destiny to have those same kind of issues. Another factor is the variation in individuals' neurotransmitters. So everyone's brain is different. How we react to different stimulus and different chemicals is also different as well. For some people, certain drugs make them feel very bad and uncomfortable, when that same drug could have a very different effect on a different person with different brain chemistry. Now, there's two really important drugs inside of your brain that we should think about when we think about addiction. And those two drugs are dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine you can maybe think of as like kind of like the happy drug. And your brain gets a rush of dopamine when you accomplish something or when something good happens to you. Say you've been working very, very hard during your season. Here comes the Big 12 championships. You win, your brain gets a flood of dopamine. Whew, you feel amazing. You've earned this. Your brain is rewarding you and telling you what a great job it is. Look at all the hard work you did. Serotonin is also important in your mood, your memory, and your sleep and cognition. And some drugs work to stop your brain from reuptaking serotonin, which can really affect these other functions as well. Now, for dopamine, if you took a drug like methamphetamines, it creates an artificial form of dopamine. The receptors in your brain that are built to accept dopamine and give off reward chemicals are hijacked by these drugs you're putting inside your body and giving you that feeling of reward without ever actually earning it. Because these drugs are taken endogenously or entered into your body, they can actually damage and blow out your dopamine receptors. So normal day-to-day stuff may no longer be as pleasurable, as exciting as it used to be because you have blown out your receptors thanks to different stimulants like cocaine or methamphetamine. So these drugs are very dangerous because they can change your ability to have a good time in real life. Now, there's a number of psychological reasons for addiction. Some of them I listed here: lacking sense of purpose, psychological distress is probably the biggest one, underlying conditions such as depression, and again, self-medicating. Most people that have significant addiction issues had some sort of psychological issue going into it, and that's why they felt relief, or at least a relief from their day-to-day life when taking illicit drugs. And what they see as self-medicating can lead very quickly to addiction and an inability to quit or get off certain substances. Again, most people who have extreme drug addiction probably had a lot of childhood trauma or other negative things going on in their life, and they use drugs as kind of a temporary way to get away from this psychological distress. Now, certain communities do have more drug issues than others. And in general, in this country, we see a lot more in urban areas where there seems to be a significantly more drug use. Well, that doesn't say rural communities don't also use drugs, but theirs are more nicotine, tobacco. Unfortunately, methamphetamines is rising in rural communities. But in inner cities, it seems to be a culture that's kind of accepted around drug usage. One of the most important factors is your peer influences. Your parents are kind of the most important people in your life up until about middle school. And then middle school, high school, you usually care more about what your peers are doing, those people around you, than your parents. So if you have a friend who's doing drugs, you are more likely to do drugs as well, which is why your parents care so much about who you're hanging out with. We also have differing cultural attitudes towards drug use. In some societies and in some homes, they may see all drugs as evil and that no one should ever try them, where in some homes and societies, they may say, oh, it's not that bad, it's kids being kids, things like that. And we've seen a big cultural shift in our society today towards at least marijuana consumption, with our governor recently signing a law that made it legal for adults to use in our community, something that seemed very far-fetched just a few decades ago. When I was living in Egypt, as soon as I would get into a taxi cab, someone would hand me a cigarette. Hang out at cafes and things like that, all the men were smoking. So there's definitely a cultural aspect to it as well, as like that was culturally accepted. And if you're part of that culture and you want to fit in, you may do those drugs as well. Now, we're looking a little bit at some of the different categories of drugs as well as what drugs are in them. If you guys want more information, I would suggest checking out some of those presentations that we heard from our classmates last week. I'll also try to put up some readings and other videos about some of these drug categories this week. So this category of drug called depressants, and they're called that because they depress or reduce stimulation in different parts of the brain, also known as downers, and they kind of lower your arousal level. And what that means is like the ability to get amped up kind of supposed to relax you down. Now, the most infamous of these drugs, alcohol, is kind of confusing to be in this category a little bit because for certain people, it reduces their ability to control themselves and actually makes them more hyper and potentially hyper aggressive. Alcohol is the king of this category, but there's also barbiturates, general narcotics, and then opiates, which we'll talk a bit about as well. Okay. Stimulants, these are the ones that induce temporary improvements of mental or physical function. Think of things like methamphetamines, cocaine, Adderall. These are sometimes called uppers. They increase alertness, wakefulness, and locomotion. Okay, and then hallucinogens are drugs that cause hallucinations. They may hear, feel sensations that seem real, but they are not. They may intensify perceptions of sensations. There's a term you may have heard of before called synesthesia, where people claim they can like hear colors and feel sound and stuff like that. They claim can happen underneath hallucinogenic drugs.